All right, Gilbertland, let us finish up section 1 and begin and finish sections 2 and 3 of chapter 8 of the Jarrett book, American Imperialism. And we have 2 slides in section 1 that we need to finish up. The Spanish-American War, we covered it in the video the other day, but I need to finish it up. The Spanish-American War was fought on 2 fronts, in the Pacific and in the Caribbean. And we'll talk a little bit about each one. Shortly after the start of the war, the United States Pacific Fleet sailed to the Philippines to aid the Filipino rebels who are ready to revolt against Spain. Now keep in mind, the Spanish, who had at one time probably the largest empire in the world, had territories all over the world. South America, Mexico, what is now part of the United States, the Caribbean, the Pacific, Africa, everywhere. And as that empire slowly crumbled, they began to lose control over those territories. And in many cases, there were open revolts against the Spanish authority. We saw that already a little bit in Cuba, and we're having the same thing happen in the Philippines. So the Filipino rebels were already revolting against the Spanish because of probably the same reasons that the Spanish were. The Spanish were often brutal toward the people that they had conquered. And so the Spanish had a history of being extremely brutal to the people that they had conquered, and the Philippines were no different. Anyway, get back to our story. The Spanish had a squadron of ships in Manila Bay, which of course is located in the Philippines, and the American Navy sent a group of ships to them and defeated them relatively easily. Now, as this is going on, the Assistant Secretary for the Navy, Teddy Roosevelt, and we've talked about him already from chapter 7, and we've already discussed him a little bit in this chapter, and we will talk about him a little bit more. He resigns as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, which is a very important job. I mean, our Navy is growing, and we'll talk about how and why that comes about in the next section. But our Navy is growing, and he held a very important position within the Navy, but he resigns and creates a volunteer force of cavalry known as the Rough Riders. Now, the Rough Riders are made up of cowboys, blacks, former slaves in some cases, any number of different kinds of people joined this volunteer group of cavalry, and led by Teddy Roosevelt, they went to Cuba to fight in the Spanish-American War, and at the Battle of San Juan Hill, the Rough Riders who were involved in the battle helped defeat the Spanish at San Juan Hill, which is the best-known battle of the entire war. So, because of the efforts of Teddy Roosevelt and his men, again, he was the leader, he was the probably best known, he was one of the organizers, he became the hero of this battle, which became the best-known battle of the war, and so therefore he became the best-known character, the best-known hero of this war. Now, again, there are many, many, many heroes who fought in this war, but he became the one who became the best known, partially because of his name, partially because of the position that he had held earlier, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, partially because he was one of the lead organizers of the Rough Riders, and partially just because of the fact that his personality was so outgoing, it was hard to ignore him. While this is going on, the U.S. Navy took Guantanamo Bay. Now, of course, we still control Guantanamo Bay. We often refer to it as Gitmo. And this is in the eastern end of the island of Cuba. And we held it, and we have it still in our possession. And it has been used as a naval base for decades, which of course annoys the heck out of the Cubans, partially, in particular, Fidel Castro. When Fidel Castro seized power in Cuba in the late 1950s, early 1960s, all the way up through, even to this day, though he no longer rules Cuba, his brother does, so they share philosophy. But anyway, it always annoyed Fidel that we were there, and there's nothing he could do about it. We had a treaty with Cuba, and if he attempted to remove us, which, number one, he couldn't, okay, But if he tried to remove us, that would be an act of war, and therefore we could invade Cuba legally, remove him, and then take Cuba back. We'll get to what happens to Cuba in a few moments. Anyway, so we are in the Philippines. We are helping Filipino rebels overthrow the Spanish, who the Filipinos have been revolting against. We defeat a Spanish fleet at Manila Bay. Teddy Roosevelt leads a group of cavalry volunteers known as the Rough Riders, defeating the enemy at San Juan Hill, which is the best known battle of the war. While this is going on, the Navy takes Guantanamo Bay, and so the war is going quite well. However, there were some negative aspects. A number of U.S. troops were forced to withdraw from Cuba because they were contracting yellow fever. Now, yellow fever is an extremely dangerous disease. It is highly deadly. It kills with a mortality rate of, well, it's a very high rate. I don't know what it is. It's probably starting, look at the period of time, we're talking about probably 80 to 90% of the people who contracted yellow fever died. We, of course, will combat yellow fever and discover how and why it occurred a little bit later on in this chapter, and we'll talk about it at that time. But because of yellow fever, we were forced to withdraw a number of our forces. Again, let's not forget, we talked about in Chapter 7, the number of American troops who died because of tainted meat. And we talked about Upton Sinclair's Jungle. His book, The Jungle, depicted the harshness and cruelty of workers in meatpacking plants, but also the unsanitary conditions. And because of those unsanitary conditions, a lot of the meat that was packed in these meatpacking plants, and again, the Jungle took place in the city of Chicago, a number of people got sick. And we had hundreds of our troops die because of the food that we were feeding them that was packed in these meatpacking plants. And so we're having really not a lot of trouble with the Spaniards, but a lot of trouble with disease and, sadly, the food that we were feeding our men. Anyway, all this is going on. Our forces were able to occupy Guam, which is in the Pacific, and the small island of Puerto Rico, which is in the Caribbean. Within 4 months, again, this was not a very long conflict. 4 months later, Spain was defeated, and the American forces were left in occupation of, we were in control of the islands of the Philippines, and there are several islands within that chain: Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam. Let's move on to the next slide, which is the last slide of Section 1. The Spanish-American War as a turning point, and this is a turning point for the United States of America. Number one, Spain's colonial empire collapsed as a result of them losing the war to us. So the Spanish-American War marked the end of Spain's colonial empire. They were no longer a colonial power, though realistically they hadn't been one for some time. They still had possessions all over the world, so technically they were an empire, but no, not really. Secondly, we have it again. This is number one. Number two, we have the emergence of the U.S. as a world power. Though we are not the dominant world power at this time, that really comes about at the end of World War I, which we're only looking at about 18 years from the point we're discussing right now. We emerge as one of the powers in the world. Not the power yet, and that comes quickly, but we are looking at one of the dominant powers. We are about to become the dominant, but not quite there yet. The war had let the United States demonstrate its naval strength, and we'll talk about how that came about in the next section. We demonstrated this naval strength to the entire world. The entire world watched, again, not literally watched, but read about our exploits in the Philippines. Now, we defeated a fleet of Spanish ships. Now, again, Spain was not what it had been decades before, but it was still an empire. It still had a formidable navy, and we took it out relatively easily. Same thing in Cuba, in the Caribbean. We had several engagements that we won rather handily, and so the rest of the world now kind of sat up and took notice of how America is becoming a bigger, more powerful threat to them. And more importantly, number 3, it raised critical issues for the Americans. For example, what should the United States do with the former Spanish colonies it was now occupying? What should we do with the former because we took them from Spain, these former colonies that we were now occupying? As a republic, as a nation with a representative democracy, we believe in self-determination, self-rule. If we become an empire, does that not betray those ideals? Okay, let me repeat that last sentence or so. I kind of got kicked off for a second. So let me go back and repeat this question just to make sure everyone got it and it wasn't cut off. What should the United States do with the former Spanish colonies it's now occupying? Again, I talked about how America being a republic, a representative democracy, if we now become an empire, force people to live under our rule, does that not betray the concepts, the principles put down in both the Declaration and the Constitution? So, this is a huge issue for us. Many historians see the war as a turning point because the U.S. had finally awakened, and I use the term finally, because again, we had been isolationist, going all the way back to Washington and his farewell address, in which he basically told the American public, number 1, be wary of political parties. Number 2, do not get involved in foreign affairs, particularly European ones. And it appears that he was correct on both cases. Anyway, we had finally awakened to our potential as a world power. And so that is why the Spanish-American War is a turning point. Okay, now that ends section 1. Let us delve into section 2, which will answer some of the questions or bring up some of the material that I mentioned a few moments ago. And here we are. Section 2, American Imperialism. By the end of the war, and we're talking 1898, 1898, there we go. The United States was occupying 4 of Spain's former colonies. We saw that in the last slide. Many Americans believe that they should annex them. We should take them under our control. We should make them part of the United States. That's what annex means. These American imperialists, these people who saw imperialism as a good thing, these American imperialists saw this as a unique opportunity, pointing out how the European powers, again, we are of European descent primarily. Now, do we have a large number of people who were from Asia, from Africa? Yes, but we were originally European, primarily English. But over the centuries, we have brought in a number of Europeans. We talked about the old immigrants, the new immigrants. The old immigrants from West and North Europe, and the new immigrants from South and Eastern Europe. We talked about that in chapter 2 ago. And so we were primarily European. And so these imperialists pointed out how the European powers had recently acquired colonies in both Africa and Asia. Now, what does this mean? Well, this means they have access to raw materials that we do not have access to. Now, of course, America is a vastly wealthy nation in terms of raw materials, but raw materials run out eventually. In addition to the raw materials that could be found in Africa and Asia, which, by the way, there were a lot of them, in addition, you now open up markets. So we can only sell so much of what we produce here in America. We need to sell to other countries around the world. We need new markets. And so while the European powers, England, France, Spain maybe a little bit, I guess, and a few of the others, the Dutch probably, while they were opening new markets, we were somewhat corralled, if you will, by our own isolationism. Now, again, this is not to say that we didn't trade. That's not true. But we were probably missing the boat, probably not taking advantage of some of the markets that were out there because of our desire to remain isolationist, and this was probably hurting us economically. So the imperialists believed the United States should take its own colonies. Again, the imperialists believed the United States should take its own colonies before there was nothing left to grab. Now, again, that kind of sounds bad. And in today's standards, it is. But you got to keep in mind, what we're looking at, the period of time we're looking at, is not based on today's standards. It's based on the standards of the day. And that's one of the huge problems with history, is that people cannot look at history through that period of time. What I mean is, they tend to look at history through the eyes of the 21st century, the political correctness of today. And if you look at anything that happened in history through those lenses, it's going to be perverted. It's not going to give you a true picture. And it's difficult to do, I understand, but that's something we have to try to do. Okay, now let's get to our Navy. Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan, who was the president of the Naval War College, and this is literally a college in which the United States government, the military, trains individuals to take leading roles in both our military and our government. Mahan was one of the leading advocates for imperial expansion. He wanted to see America grow, to take on new possessions, to open those areas for exploration of raw materials, to open those areas for new markets. Teddy Roosevelt, and Teddy played a huge role in the late early 1900s development of America, was one of Mahan's followers. Mahan wrote a book. Let me clean this up a little bit so that way we can see it real clearly. Mahan wrote a book entitled The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, and this was written in 1890, 8 years prior to the Spanish-American War. Mahan focused on the harsh political realities of expansion. Again, today, this is not something we would contemplate, but we're looking at well over 100 years ago. If you were strong enough to take land from another country, you got to keep it. If you weren't strong enough to hold on to your land, another country would take it. That was just the reality of the day. And what Mahan, Teddy Roosevelt, and many other imperialists, some in government, some out of government, some big business leaders, they wanted us, the United States, to expand, to again open new markets, to acquire new raw materials. Okay, so Mahan argued that to achieve world power, which again is something that we were looking at, a country needed a powerful navy. Since, 3/4 of the world's surface is covered by water, if you're going to be a powerful nation, you need a powerful navy. Not only a military navy, but also a commercial navy. For this country, a country also needed, again, a large merchant marine force, a large number of civilian ships, merchant ships, to supply its sailors. So you need a large navy. You need a steam-powered navy. You need a large steam-powered steel navy. And all the ships required to supply those ships. You need to have ships to protect, which kind of sounds strange when you think about it. We needed a merchant fleet to carry our raw materials, our finished goods, around the world. We needed a strong military navy to protect it. And this is what Mahan argued for. Again, go back to this. For this, a country also needed a large merchant marine to supply its sailors. Finally, a world power required colonies and naval bases to provide coaling stations for its steamships and to create trade needed to support its merchant ships. So what Mahan argued for was, one, a new navy powered by steam, built with steel, and with enough naval bases, both military and civilian, naval bases around the world so we could stop and resupply. One of the problems with steamships is, of course, you need to heat water. And the source of heat at this time, what was burned to provide that heat, was coal. And a ship can only carry so much. There's only so much space, there's only so much weight a ship can carry. And so in order to provide the coal, the water, the food, the supplies a navy needs, we needed locations around the world, in the Caribbean, in the Atlantic, in the Pacific. which is why the American imperialists wanted to go to war with Spain to possibly gain some territories in the Caribbean or in the Pacific in order to achieve what Mahan had put in his book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. Let's go to the next slide. And this is the continuation of Mahan and the imperialists, because other powers were competing. And again, we're not out there alone. England, France, even Spain, even though they had just lost the war with us, they still thought themselves as a power. While other powers were competing for naval supremacy in world markets, Mahan believed it was essential for America to seize control of Pacific trade routes. He also believed it was essential that we construct a canal through Central America and dominate the Caribbean region. So Mahan believed, and again, Mahan was a well-known admiral. He had served in the Navy for decades. He was well-respected, and he had followers like Teddy Roosevelt, people who believed in his vision. So Mahan believed, and let me clear all this off, and let's do this again, because this is extremely important. Mahan believed in a number of things, okay? Number one, Pacific trade routes. We had to control them by using a military navy. Number two, we had to construct a canal through Central America, which we eventually do, and we'll take that up in a future presentation, through Panama. By doing so, it would cut off thousands of miles of steaming around the southern tip of South America and save weeks, possibly months of travel. And in business, time is money. The quicker I can get my goods to market, the more likely I am to make money. So, number one, seize control of the Pacific trade routes. Number two, canal through Central America. Number three, dominate the Caribbean. The Caribbean is at the mouth of the Gulf of Mexico, which of course in the Gulf you have the Gulf states, Texas, Louisiana, all the way through Florida, and a number of important ports, not to mention the Mississippi River coming through New Orleans. And so a lot of the trade that comes out of New Orleans comes from the farmers up the Mississippi. And so if we cannot control the Caribbean, other countries control it, let's say, then our ability to ship goods out of that area from up the Mississippi, Iowa, Nebraska, and they ship their corn, their wheat, down the Mississippi, load it on international ships, and then sell it around the world and sell it. If we cannot control the Caribbean and another country does, then we lose that ability, and it's going to cost us tons of money and lots of jobs. So by controlling that region, America would then control the sea lanes from the Caribbean all the way across the Pacific, all the way to China and Japan, which were two of the emerging markets in the world. So, seize control of Panama, the Pacific trade routes, construct a canal through Central America, dominate the Caribbean. This would then allow us control of the shipping lanes all over the world. Of course, for every imperialist, there's going to be some anti-imperialists. Let's take a quick look at them, and we're going to finish it up with this. On the other hand, the United States itself had once consisted of 13 colonies. A lot of people remember our own colonial days and the problems that we had with our parent country, England. Even as late as the 1890s, many Americans felt uneasy about forcing colonial rule on others based on the negative experiences we had when we were possession of England. Opponents of colonialism, Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, two names that we know quite well. Mark Twain is one of the more influential voices in America, and Carnegie is one of the richest men in America. Both these and others, these are just two that are mentioned in the book, these two felt imperialism violated the basic democratic principles of self-government on which the United States was founded. Again, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, this is our dilemma. If we become an empire, what does that say about us, and how does that coincide with how do we reconcile that, becoming an empire, with what was written in the Declaration and the Constitution? Some of these anti-imperialists formed a group called the American Anti-Imperialist League, which was formed in 1898. Toward the end of the war, and the idea behind this league was to oppose the acquisition of colonies. Now, I think this is our last slide this is our last slide of section 2. Let me finish this. I told you before we're going to go through section 3 as well. We're not going to. We're going to finish this. This presentation is a little bit longer than I really intended, so let's finish this slide and we'll stop it. In the end, the imperialists won. Okay, we know that. We acquired and kept those possessions, and we'll talk about what happens with them a little bit later on in the book. The imperialists won the argument. After the Spanish-American War, the United States acquired a colonial empire. Again, it's that simple. We became an empire. Not so much in the sense that we think of the English empire that once we were a part of, or the Spanish empire and how it conquered what we refer to as Latin America, but we did become an empire in the sense that we now had overseas territories. Among them were the Philippines, Guam, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Samoa, Midway. You could even throw in Alaska, though it's not mentioned here. We did own Alaska, acquired it a few years before. One U.S. senator and an anti-imperialist league member mourned the danger that we are to be transformed from a republic founded on the Declaration of Independence into a vulgar common empire founded on force. And so he, the senator, who is not named, stated the danger is that we are to be transformed from a republic, which we are guaranteed in the Constitution, founded on the concepts of self-determination, self-governance, founded on the Declaration of Independence, and we are to become a vulgar common empire, founded on force, because most empires, all of them I guess, are founded on force, maintained by force. And so that is what the anti-imperialists were opposed to and were afraid of. We would become what we had left in the 1770s. A congressional resolution passed just before the war. We are not even in the war yet. So we're passing resolutions what we're going to do with what we win after the war is over. Anyway, a congressional resolution passed just before the war guaranteed the independence of Cuba, which, by the way, does come eventually. But not quickly. Even this island came under the informal control of the United States. Again, we passed a resolution in Congress saying that we're going to free Cuba. We do, but it's going to take about 4 or 5 decades before we do. Cubans were forced, there we go, what the anti-imperialists were opposed to, they were forced to agree to the Platt Amendment. Now, the Platt Amendment, and again, what the book has is a very quick look at it. We'll take a little bit more look at the Platt Amendment when we get to our vocabulary terms. But the Platt Amendment basically stated the United States had the right to intervene in Cuban affairs anytime we want. So we forced, kind of at gunpoint, the Cubans to agree to the Platt Amendment, which said that we, the United States, can intervene, we can step in, we can interfere with Cuban politics, Cuban affairs, anytime we want. Okay, now this has gone a lot longer than I anticipated. Hopefully this was helpful to you. We'll come back soon with the next section of Chapter 8, American Imperialism. Bye.